Hi, everyone. We'll just give everyone that's going to be joining us a couple minutes to join, and then we'll get started. Should have just said 1 minute. This feels kind of long. As soon as it says 31, I'm going to start. Oh, there we go. So, hi, welcome everyone. My name is Luis Mendez. I'm a partner in Bressler's Birmingham, Alabama office, and we're here today for a CLE presentation titled Navigating Bias in the Legal Field. We have three excellent panel members to discuss this topic from three of our different offices, and I'm going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves now, starting with Katie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Wilson, and I am an associate in the Securities Practice Group in the Birmingham office.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea Bombacino. I'm an associate in the Business and Commercial Litigation Group in our Florham Park office.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jackie Aleman. I'm an associate also in the Business Litigation and Commercial Group, and I work from the Miami office.
Great. So thanks everyone for saying yes when I offered this up as a potential CLE presentation. I'm really glad that all three of you agreed, because I think you all have great perspectives on this, and I look forward to sharing them with everyone that's joined us today. So I was kind of hoping we'd start with a few roundtable discussion questions and kind of throw it out to the group of whoever wanted to answer first. But what do you think of when you hear the term implicit bias?
I can get us started. My initial thought is, what I think about when I see a stranger walking down the street and how maybe I have judgments about them based on their gender or their skin color or what they're wearing, just the snap judgments you make about people. But it's important, as we're going to talk about, to remember that you also have these implicit unconscious biases about people and it might not necessarily match up with what your conscious thoughts about them, but we all have these biases just because it's a product of how our brain works, and it's important to acknowledge them so that they don't shape our behavior, and so we aren't discriminating against people based on them.
Great. That was a great summation. But Andrea, any thoughts when I say the term implicit bias?
I think I would just add that you generally can be very negative and have a very negative connotation when we think of that. And while we certainly don't want to be behaving based on those biases, we don't want to be so negative about them that we refuse to acknowledge that, yes, of course, we do have them. It's a human thing to have a preconceived notion of something.
Jackie, what would you like to add?
I think of stereotypes, especially when you assume, let's say, someone has a specific background or they're of a specific race, you assume that they're a certain way. So it's really important to really just increase your exposure to people of different backgrounds, diverse individuals, and also change your stereotype.
Great. Well, I think that's, a great jumping off point to get us started. Maybe also, I guess, sometimes people like to share war stories on either dealing with, being the subject of, maybe even more of an explicit bias. Anyone have a good story they'd like to share?
I'll jump in. Not really a war story, but just something very particular, and it's happened to me. And I guess maybe it's the nature of the practice of what I do. But I was recently on a case where I was the only diverse attorney, where it was a group of, I believe, 5 white male attorneys. And they all behave very professionally, very courteous, but it's just I don't know if the word is intimidating or different, but you just feel kind of like the only person in the room. I think for me in particular, just based on my background, I am from Venezuela originally. I practice law in Venezuela. So for me, this whole diversity concept, not that it's new, but when I practiced law back in Venezuela, everyone else pretty much looked like me. So moving here to the States and practicing law in the States, and in particular in litigation, you are confronted with situations where there are not a lot of people that are similar to you. So.
Yeah. Katie, a good war story?
Yeah, I mean, I think all women have some experience with being, mistaken for being, a court reporter or a paralegal or something. I actually, when I was trying to think about my own biases, and so I took the implicit association test when I was getting ready for this, which I think some people might be familiar with. It's a test that some Harvard researchers came up with that measures unconscious bias, and it's most well known for the test based on race. But I took the gender test that evaluates how you associate gender with career or family concepts. And when I got to the end, it told me that most participants more strongly associate males with career and females with family. As I think we could have all guessed that, but it told me that I actually did so more than the average participant, which was upsetting to find out. I just consider myself someone who cares a lot about gender issues and would never, outwardly think that men are, more suited for career than women, but I still had these implicit biases. So it's an interesting way to evaluate your own biases, is to take that test.
Yeah, it kind of helps reinforce the point where whatever you kind of view, even as your own worldview might be, there's still an underlying implicit bias that could affect it. So it's good to be aware of that. Andrea?
I mean, I think like Katie said, we generally, as women, are commonly, the only women in the room, especially when we're in the courtroom. I certainly have enough stories of those, but for myself, it's always interesting when you get a new case and you're dealing with a new adversary. When you first start working with them, you find yourself behaving in a certain way sometimes that you need to take a step back and go, am I behaving based on how my adversary is actually responding, or am I using experiences that I have from similar adversaries to behave to inform my behavior here, and taking a step back to determine whether that's actually the best course is always important.
Yeah, I mean, I think, generally as a group, we try to be conscious of these things, and whether they're impacting our own behavior, whether it's impacting others' behavior towards us. I think we've got 3 great studies that we, kind of split up amongst us to discuss that kind of reinforce this point. So I'll start with Katie's study, which is called Walking Out the Door. Katie, can you give us a little background on this study?
Yeah, so this was published by the ABA in 2019. It was part of an initiative the ABA started, I think in 2017. The initiative is called Achieving Long-Term Careers for Women in Law. So they did this study and they did several others. I think Jackie's study is also part of the same initiative. So this one specifically looks at large law firms and why women are leaving. But before getting into the results of the study, just some statistics of why this was necessary, why this initiative got started, and kind of statistics that explain the gender gaps that still exist in the practice of law. So even though, and this is large law firms in particular, so I think right now more women are graduating law school than men, but in large law firms, women and men start in almost equal numbers. Women are about 45%, so men are about 55%. But over time that changes. Only 30% of non-equity partners are women, and only 20% of equity partners are. And so something that makes that a little more alarming is that it's been the case for several decades now that women and men are starting in almost equal numbers. So it's not just a matter of women needing to advance in their careers in a matter of time, where in 20 years it'll be different. And actually the study cited a different study which predicted that there will not be gender parity in terms of equity partners until the year 2181. So that is a very alarming statistic. It's hard to even think about, but it also talks about some differences in compensation. And at large firms, male partners on average make 53% more than female partners. And it starts early, just 2 or 3 years into practice, women are already making 5% less. And 6 years in, they're making, or we're making 13% less. And 12 years in, it's 20% less. So, there's a lot of gaps. There's also just talking about the relationship partners and how at these large firms that the participants worked at, 80% of relationship partners for those clients are men. And 93% of firms report that their most compensated partner is a man. Then those same 93% looking at the top 10 earners, no more than one was a woman. So just some numbers to show all the gaps that kind of led to the initiative and led to the need for these studies. So what this particular one looked at is there were 1,262 people who participated. They all work at the country's 350 largest firms. They've all been practicing 15 years or more. So the study focused on 3 main categories: everyday experiences of men and women, then why do experienced women stay and why do they leave, and what are firms doing about this? What are firms doing to try to keep women? So the everyday experiences, participants were asked a lot of questions about their overall job satisfaction, and men and women report similar levels of satisfaction regarding things like the intellectual challenge of their work, the actual tasks they perform, their relationship with colleagues, all things related to the actual work being done. Men and women are similarly satisfied, but men and women have pretty different levels of satisfaction when it comes to things like recognition for work, compensation, methods by which compensation is determined, opportunities for advancement, workplace gender diversity, firm leadership. So a lot of things that revolve around kind of the intangibles, and I guess compensation is very tangible, but things about advancing and more about how they're being treated at work. A lot of this is where implicit bias can come in of compensation could be different because women are, although the firm doesn't realize, they are paying women less, and women are thinking that they're being paid less because they're a woman. So another area.
Katie, if you don't mind me jumping in there, because it's a good question that came in the chat, and should have mentioned this at the start, but as questions come in, we'll try to get to them. If we have some time at the end, we'll kind of wrap up. And I'm interested in the whole panel's thoughts on this. But what do you think that pay gap that you're specifically talking about right now is attributed to, or what would you attribute it to?
It didn't really. The study didn't, directly examine that, but I think one of the reasons, like, you said about how the relationship partners belong to men and not women, and things like that. When the study gets to what should be done, one of the recommendations is to have clear policies about compensation, and having clear policies can help make sure that people are being compensated in the same way.
Sorry for cutting you off. I think you were about to get into the reasons to stay and leave, which was the second focus of the study.
A couple more things on on differences in treatment, just of women are 82% of women have said they've been mistaken for a lower level employee, while 0% of men have, or sorry, based on gender, have been mistaken for a lower level employee based on their gender. So 0% of men said that they had. And it also looked at sexual harassment and how 50% of women say that they have experienced unwanted sexual contact and only 6% of men have. So all of these things just show that women are being treated differently than men and think that they're being treated differently than men, and are just dealing with what the study refers to as death by 1,000 cuts, and just having these different experiences that men are not having to deal with.
Hard to argue with statistics, which are just flat percentages and really jarring when you think about 50% of women experiencing, unwanted sexual contact. That seems absurdly high to me in a workplace. So what about the reasons for staying and leaving?
Yeah, so the participants in the study said that women typically stay because they enjoy the work and they enjoy relationships with colleagues. Some women also said the reason for staying is opportunity for advancement and financial compensation, but that was also a somewhat popular reason for leaving. The most popular reasons for leaving were a lot of things outside of work, and kind of the need for women to do it all, like caretaking commitments, personal reasons, work-life balance, also just stress level, emphasis on marketing and originating business, number of billable hours. So like I said, the article points out a lot of it boils down to stress and the need to do it all. And obviously men have duties outside of work too, but it looks at how this is often put on women more than men, and asked participants with children about childcare and how often they're responsible for it. And 54% of women said arranging childcare was their full responsibility, while only 1% of men did. And then 32% of women said leaving work for childcare was their full responsibility, while only 4% of men did. Lewis actually almost had to leave this very presentation for childcare.
I sole responsibility, I wouldn't say, but I will also mention that someone on the street the other day congratulated me for taking care of my son by myself. So, there's I would say a more explicit bias underlying that congratulations, but yeah. So, as you're talking about the study and kind of its results, it just strikes me it's a lot about how we value people. So did the study have any kind of recommendations on how law firms can better value women and promote women?
Yeah, so it looked at what firms are doing that the respondents thought was successful. So a lot of them work from home policies, paid parental leave, formal part-time policies, things, again, addressing the need to do it all. But participants also thought that some successful policies were clear, consistent criteria for promotion to equity partner, client succession planning policies that include women, focusing on training female lawyers, things like that. So those were what the participants said were what they saw as being successful. So the study then made recommendations based on that. So first is just develop strategies, set targets, and establish timelines. If you just say you want to increase the number of women, but you don't define it, it's going to be a lot harder to actually accomplish the goal if you don't set real goals. Also suggested you can always get an outside consultant to come in and help and point out what would be beneficial. Then also just using gender metrics and statistics to track these things over time. And this could be just tracking the number of partners, tracking the number or women partners, tracking compensation so that you can see, are men and women being compensated the same? Are we promoting people to partner in the same ratios. So, I think it's easy if you don't track it to look and say, well, we have women partners, so we're obviously doing a good job. But is it just 20%, and same with compensation. Well, we don't think we're discriminating, but are we? So helping actually track the data can help make sure that you're not having these implicit biases that affect these decisions.
This is kind of a broad question and more, not specifically for Katie, but kind of for the group. But there's a lot of, policies and what we can do for tracking and such. But what do people think we could do to actually address the implicit bias itself that leads to, the percentages and, that we're talking about in these studies? That's the question, right?
we all wish we had the answer. I guess, one relatively easy thing is training on implicit bias. Because like we've said, just being aware of it helps you to make sure that it doesn't influence your behavior. Bressler's actually doing our implicit bias training right now. I did mine on Monday.
Yeah, and when you mentioned the Harvard IAT test, that seems like it could be a useful exercise as well, just to kind of take every so often, honestly, to kind of see where you're stacking up, where your biases are, and then having a better framework through which to review these types of, metrics, and why things are a certain way. I guess, that's a pretty thorough covering of that study. I appreciate it, Katie. Maybe move on to Jackie's study, Left Out and Left Behind. Jackie, tell me a little bit about the study and how it got implemented, how it got started.
Of course. So this was part of the same initiative that Katie said that was started by the ABA in 2017. This article in particular, the study was conducted in 2020. And I think it goes a step further from Katie's survey and findings because it analyzes in particular women of color in the legal profession. So the study found that for every 100 associates, only 12 are women of color, and for every 100 partners, about 5 are women of color. The study found that women of color stay in the legal profession because, one, they often enjoy the work despite the environment. And this is something that I particularly identify. Being an attorney is challenging. It keeps you on your toes. You learn new things. Sometimes I feel like you feel that you're pushed to the limit, but all of it ultimately ends up in growing professionally. Second point was it is financially sensible and meets financial needs and desires of the individuals in the study. And the third is that aspects of their personal, community, and familiar lives may require or encourage it. So the study shows that women of color, one, are more inclined to be subjected to both implicit and explicit bias. And there was a really interesting quote from the study, which I'm going to read very quickly. And it says, it's from a Black woman in her early 40s. She says, "I have to prove myself over and over again. I share office space with a white male attorney. Even though my name is first on the door, people presume that I'm his secretary. They have never presumed that he is mine." So that's a little bit, and it goes along with the war stories that I know many of us have where women are confused for assistants, for paralegals. So you see it's something that happens frequently. Second part of the survey showed that women of color are denied formal and informal networking and promotional opportunities. Third, they find it harder to meet billable hour requirements, and they have different work-life needs and challenges than white women. And this ties in, it's that women of color are more likely to report having extended family responsibilities and personal responsibilities that include participating in community activities. Women of color also have people from their family, more family members living with them. They're actively involved in these types of activities. So what was done in the study? 103 self-identified women of color that graduated law school at least 15 plus years before, engaged in 38 different focus groups and participated by sharing experiences. And the takeaways and recommendations from the study. So first, adopt better practices for reducing biases in decision-making. And this goes with what we were speaking about, training, self-assessment tests are also very important. Two, improve access to effective and engaged mentors and sponsors. And I think it's important to really talk about the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. And an example is that mentors may help you network, but a sponsor will actually actively include you in their professional network. And I read a very interesting article from the Harvard Business Review about how we should really actively sponsor women of color. And from my personal experience, once I was sponsored by someone here when I moved to the US and started practicing law in the US, I feel that my professional development really changed. I was included in more firm committees. I was given more speaking engagements and opportunities, and I was actually introduced to more people at the firm. So I think it's really important that all of us individually really commit to sponsoring individuals, diverse individuals. Also, the study also said, and I thought this was a really interesting example, is that a sponsor is really like a brand manager or a publicist for their proteges. Another takeaway is to incorporate an intersectional approach to addressing diversity and gender. And that's just a really fancy way of saying that we need to recognize that people's social identities can overlap, and this creates compounding experiences of discrimination. And this also, I feel that it has happened to me, where I actually have a friend at the firm who has a completely different background. She is from a place that I think is like across the globe from Venezuela. And ever since I met her, we've become really good friends, and we've really shared experiences of, moving to the US and practicing from here in the US and the cultural differences. And even though she and I are from complete different backgrounds, we really shared those experiences and have really, I guess, have a camaraderie here at the firm.
Yeah. Tamar actually just shouted herself out.
Yep.
In the chat, so we all know you were talking about Tamar, but
I love Tamar. Okay.
Yeah.
Also, to create a more inclusive culture in the legal profession by hiring diverse attorneys from people of different backgrounds, different races, gender identities. The study also highlights the importance of giving space to underrepresented groups in the law firm to find community. And it also emphasizes that experiences of women of color, of different backgrounds, are not a monolith. And I also did some thinking over the weekend and really thought about how at least I can also be a better person and helping with my implicit biases. And I made a short list. And one of them was really focusing on seeing people as individuals and not defining them, due to where they're from or their background or even their gender identity. Also, really consciously change stereotypes, adjusting my perspective, and also increasing my exposure to people of different backgrounds and identities.
Yeah, I love the concept of active sponsorship. I was at a Hispanic bar conference recently, and they just came out. Their new kind of slogan is "Lift as you climb." So it's kind of recognizing that even as when I say lift as you climb, how can someone kind of lift as they climb even early in their careers? Do you have any thoughts when I say that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I really try to go out of my way, and especially with the younger associates that I'm working with and that are associates of color and of diverse backgrounds, I really try to teach them the soft skills of being an attorney. And not that I'm an expert, but I have been practicing, for a little bit longer and in two different places. But really, no one teaches you how to really harness those soft skills. And you just assume that you learn them along the way. But sometimes people of different backgrounds, they're the first in their family to be an attorney. They don't have any exposure to this environment. And this can be a really tricky and challenging environment. So I really try to, aside from developing them professionally and, giving them assignments and reviewing their assignments, is really, teach them how to deal with clients, how to, draft really good and efficient emails, how to network, how to participate in different groups, how, get out there, come to the office, meet, it's so important to really meet and talk to even a partner about something, unrelated to the law. But I think those are soft skills that really no one teaches you. And I try to go out of my way to do that.
Great. So, well, as far as firm policies, there are a lot of, and we've talked about kind of firm policies that can help with women generally, but what do you think would be more helpful specifically for women of color?
First, to really make an effort in hiring women of color, and not only just, from the get-go when they start fresh out of law school, but also hiring, laterals, women of color that are partners. I think that's a really good step that firms can take. Also training, like we've discussed before. Also having policies flexible, work from home policies. I think that's very important, understanding that typically women of color have more responsibilities at home, and it may be harder for them to be at the office, 24/7 all the time. I think that's important. Having, clear and empathetic communication. Sometimes we feel like we're on an island, and especially when we practice in an area where it's all men. So when you have really clear and consistent, and especially with the pandemic where all of us were working from home for so long, sometimes you just feel a little bit isolated. So I think that's an important step to really keep communication open.
Yeah, as we were talking about this last week, preparing for this webinar, and I was just, thinking about it over the weekend, it's kind of the whole structure is set up for the white man with no, familial responsibilities. So kind of it's a push and pull to kind of readapt the structure of law firms to kind of fit everyone's experiences as we try to become more inclusive.
Exactly.
So great. Andrea, you're up. Sustaining pathways to diversity. I think it differs from the prior two studies in kind of an important way. What was this study all about?
Right, so the Minority Corporate Counsel Association conducted a survey of corporate legal departments in order to evaluate how they differ from law firms. The hypothesis going in was that generally, when we're having these conversations, we generally focus on the law firm and the law firm culture and how does the corporate legal department differ or look the same as what's going on in the law firms. So they did a study looking at diversity metrics to look at both, what leadership looked like in corporate legal departments, but also what initiatives were being implemented there to establish any different types of changes that they may see. So there were about 120 different corporate members that were evaluated that in total employ about 8,342 different lawyers that were part of this survey. And the statistics were different from what you see in law firms, but obviously not where we want to be just yet. So 38% of the survey of the participants said that their top legal position was an individual of an ethnic or racial minority. About 44% of the companies said that the top legal officer position was held by a woman, and 23 of those people found that it was a woman of an ethnic or racial minority, which, as we talked about in Katie's survey, when we talked about women and law firms, these are definitely closer numbers to the 50-50 we all hope for, but we're still not there even in a corporate legal department. When we're looking at what type of diversity programs these departments held, but 57% said that there was some type of inclusion program being held. 78% of the companies that said that they either collaborated or partnered with an organization in an effort to further their diversity outreach, which is of course beneficial for us all to do. They also looked at how the corporate legal departments were tracking and measuring the diversity efforts and who was responsible for that. And about 39% of these companies reported that outside counsel was tracking this information. And 27% found that they were basing their relationships on different law firms based on what the diversity metrics of that law firm was. And 32% said that they had stopped working with outside counsel because they felt that outside counsel was doing poorly in their diversity reach efforts, which of course, as a law firm, we want to have strong relationships with outside corporate legal departments. It's certainly something that we all need to be aware of. And while not the main reason why we should be looking at diversity efforts, certainly something that we should be aware of.
So you know, they're still not where we want to be. Some obvious kind of, I would say, even striking differences comparing corporate legal departments with law firms. How, if any way, do you think implicit bias may be playing into those differences between corporate legal departments and law firms?
Well, I think a lot of it goes back to our traditional thoughts about what goes on in a law firm, what the work of a law firm is versus what the work of a corporate legal department is. The consideration of whether or not what we believe and whether this is true or not remains to be seen, but the is law firm culture more difficult to deal with for women and diversity and and minorities. The statistics certainly seem to indicate that that may be the case, or is it possible that just corporate legal departments are providing more resources for women of color, women and minorities that allow them to overcome the issues of implicit bias?
Yeah, it's interesting to think of law firms as kind of more of a monolith that can't adapt to different types of people working as attorneys there than a corporate legal department. But they seemingly have been better at it. Obviously, the statistics bear that out, and are also kind of the impetus moving law firms along with certain policies about required diversity of their outside counsel and such. So have you had any experience with kind of these policies requiring diversity on the outside counsel? Has anyone had experience with that? Can anyone speak to kind of that effect that has had? It's a question out of left field, so. Well, I'll just say that, I think that those policies are well-meaning. I think that, the story that you hear about them from other, diverse attorneys, female attorneys, is that, they frequently end up getting put in a situation where they're just the token diversity hours on a certain client's bill. They're not really being brought into the fold on any client work like that type of policy is intended to do. So I think, the best, my kind of takeaway, then sorry to answer my own question, but, it is really that as a law firm to view those policies not as like requirements, but as this is what your clients are telling you they want you to do. So in the same way that they want a certain research memo on a certain issue, or want a 50-state survey on, certain laws applicable to powers of attorney or whatever it may be, this is the client telling you, well, we want our outside counsel teams to be diverse. And so it's not so much fulfilling a requirement, but kind of readapting how we staff cases and such.
It's so important for us to be reflecting of the world, right? We, as litigators, our ultimate job is to present our client's position to a jury of people of the world and of the community, and that community is a diverse community. So when we are functioning in a law firm and we are, as we've said a few times, just a group of white men, that is not reflective of the community, that's not reflective of the jury panel. We're not able to bring those experiences of that jury panel and those considerations that we know they're going to be having in front of to consider. We're not able to prepare for them. So when we're putting on our client's case at a trial, we're not doing the best we can because we just don't have as wide a breadth of experience as we could if we were to be as diverse as the world we work in.
Yeah, and sorry, I realize now, and Andy, thank you for the reminder, our CLE code. So the first CLE code is policy. Policy. How many times do I have to say that? Well, yeah, I again, and that's generally what we're striving for is in these diversity and inclusion efforts is to get to a point where we are replicating society in every aspect of society. So I guess we kind of talked about this generally, but what are kind of the implications for this minority corporate counsel association study for law firms that typically work with our clients are in-house legal departments at corporations typically? What do you think the implications are for us?
I think the implication is that if we want to continue working with corporate legal departments, we need to be working to be better, to be more reflective of the clients that we're working with, who are becoming more reflective of the world around us.
Yeah, and I think it's important to kind of build up a stable of young, great women attorneys and attorneys of color. So again, because a lot of this, the burden of this is often borne by those attorneys, and if you only have so many, there's only they end up bearing that burden more and more frequently, which just kind of exacerbates everything we've been talking about. So, I guess we've gone 40 minutes without mentioning the pandemic. Someone said pandemic earlier, but I think that's a good place for us to kind of talk about what the pandemic has done to all this. Jackie, you introduced this study to the group, so why don't you, it's not in our slideshow, but we'll just talk about it. What's the study and what's kind of the background on it?
Of course. So the ABA released a study last year about practicing law in the pandemic and moving forward. And it included, essentially, it was a survey of attorneys, both attorneys of color, diverse attorneys, and also white attorneys and male and female. And the study showed, no surprise here, that diverse attorneys and women attorneys were most affected by the pandemic. The study showed that women attorneys typically, aside from working from home, also had childcare responsibilities, school responsibilities. So they were affected most. And it's interesting because the study has a couple takeaways that I thought were particularly interesting, and we discussed them with the group. Was, one of them, and I spoke about it earlier, was really the firm or an employer should have clear and empathetic and constant communications with its employees. And part of the pandemic is that we were working from home. And I know many of us, and I include myself there, felt really isolated. And I think one of the perks of coming to the office is that, we have a sort of community here at the firm. And we're here, almost every day. We spend so many hours here. So when we suddenly started working from home, we felt kind of like we were on an island. So that's one of the takeaways, having clear, constant, and most of all, empathetic conversations with your employees, and recognizing that people have different situations. I spoke to individuals that had their parents, living with them during the pandemic, aside from their kids, and sometimes were very overwhelmed with work responsibility and also with family responsibility. Also was adopting, flex time or part-time or, flexible work schedules, and also recognizing that people have different, responsibilities. So I think that's also an important policy that employers can implement.
Yeah, I mean, there was a quote from the study, and I'll just read it. The pandemic has exacerbated the already disproportionate childcare burden on women lawyers. Women and attorneys of color are more stressed than their white male counterparts, and the pandemic has stalled many firms' diversity and inclusion efforts. I mean, it's not like we started talking about diversity and inclusion when the pandemic started. How have we not learned anything? How do we just let the pandemic make everything worse?
I think people especially were like in emergency mode and really figuring out what we had to do. And even conversations like this and a panel like this, I feel are so important because, we're actually talking about this and addressing ways and how we can make it better. So I think moving forward, we really have to make an effort in, training, self-assessing, sponsoring is such an important part, and even having these conversations and realizing that we really have more in common than what we think we do.
Well, and kind of opening it up to the group, where are there opportunities, to use the pandemic to our advantage moving forward? Is there anything we learn there that we can use going forward?
I think definitely, my study was from before the pandemic and talked about the importance of implementing work from home policies and flex policies. I think the good thing about the pandemic is hopefully employers are much more open to work from home policies now. It was beneficial to people before then, but now we've seen that it can be done and it can be done well. And, just because people are at home doesn't mean they're not doing their jobs. Where if there was any sort of resistance before the pandemic to not wanting people to work from home because you need them to be in the office to know that they're getting their job done or whatever. Some people are still working from home. I think a lot of companies haven't gone back. So, I think it opens the door for successful work from home policies, and flex time policies too. We've learned we can all be flexible and we don't all have to be in the office, during business hours every day. So
If ever there was a model that was, that lended itself to working at whatever time, whenever, it would be the billable hour model. So, that, Andrea, any kind of opportunities that we can take from the pandemic and help moving forward?
Yeah, I think one of the other things the pandemic really highlighted the need for was just resources when it comes to wellness and mental health, and different resources for parents and for caregivers to have from the firm. And one of the, it also jumping off of Jackie's point, the need for communication in those things. I think sometimes, especially as women, we may be hesitant to raise our hand for the need for that. And I think the pandemic, if it did anything, it kind of highlighted that this is more of a universal need than we've been acknowledging.
Yeah,
And just to add to that, sorry, Louis, that I feel that, and I've had this happen to myself, where you constantly have to prove yourself, right? And as a litigator, you have to prove that you can do it all, that you're aggressive, that you can overcome any challenge. So I think the pandemic really showed us that we're all a little bit vulnerable. And it's okay to speak to someone and say, I'm going through this, I'm having a tough time. So I think that's also important to recognize.
Yeah, that's increased vulnerability, I think, would be helpful for all, and awareness of what other people are going through.
Exactly.
I guess we've talked through these studies, and as we're talking, I'm getting, it's a little bit of a changing gears here, but you walk into a room like Jackie, the room you were speaking about at the beginning, it's 5 white male attorneys. Kind of what you're aware of, what an implicit or an explicit bias may be toward you as you walk in that room. What are your kind of strategies, if any, for dealing with that? You're talking about always having to prove yourself, and while that is obviously should not be the case in many rooms that you walk into, unfortunately you have to. So what's the strategy for that?
Well, I think, and I've also discussed this with another attorney, a partner at the firm, I find myself that I have to, and I don't know if this really answers your question, but I have to wear dark colors. I have to dress more seriously. I tend to wear black or navy blue, just because you really have to prove that, you're serious, that you're smart, wearing glasses, that whole thing. But I think in the end, and it's what's happened to me, and I've been fortunate enough, with time, I think those other attorneys learn to respect me, that they understand that, I didn't just graduate, I do have experience. So I think really just trying to deal with that. It's interesting because in another article, and I've seen this too, in the article that I discussed, women, when typically, they get their name called out, or in court, the judge calls them by their first name, instead of when with a male counterpart, it's, Mr. So-and-so, his last name. So it can be frustrating, but I think hopefully, with conversations like this, with people becoming more aware, hopefully I'm hopeful that the environment will change.
So, I mean, I think every time emphasizing the importance of having these conversations, I think every time we do have one, there's something that I'm, someone who views himself a certain way becomes more aware of as well. So, the first name thing, that's something to be conscious of. So Katie, Andrea, kind of strategies for dealing with implicit biases?
Well, I think another thing that's really helpful, going back to your sponsorship, is knowing that, the firm and people at the firm have my back, right? So I can be going into a room and I'm not sure what's going to happen, but we're at a point and I know that if an issue comes up, I can stand up for myself, and I know that people at the firm will support the fact that I had to stand up for myself. Recently I was on a case management conference, and I had an adversary who was talking down to me and trying to educate me on the discovery rules in New Jersey. And I had to kind of stand up and say, wait a minute, no, I know what my obligations are. I thank you for trying to remind me of my obligations, but I've been practicing long enough. I know what they are. And I'm doing this in front of the court, which of course is not something I like to do, but the situation had to call for it. And I was able to get off that call and then call the rest of my team and say, listen, this just happened, and know that I wasn't then going to be penalized for the fact that I had to be a little bit assertive in the middle of a case management conference.
Yeah, and just hopping off of Andrea, that's so true. And it's so comforting, to say the word, that one of the partners here at the firm, who is not diverse, has told me, if anything happens, I will go in there, and I will, fight for you, argue for you, whatever you need, you have my back. So it's important to feel that you're supported here at the firm.
I think it's not always easy to, point out to someone if they are treating you differently because you're a woman or something that might not be well received, but they themselves might not realize they're doing it. So if you can do it in a way that doesn't make the situation worse, maybe it would help them change their behavior if they actually realize that that's what they're doing.
Yeah, and at least give them an opportunity to reevaluate. And I guess, that kind of plays into kind of my final question for everyone here, unless, we get questions from the attendees, but what advice do you have for someone who slips up, someone who uses a word or is condescending in a manner that they should not have been? What's the best thing someone can do in that situation to correct the behavior or to address it in the moment?
Well, first, I would say recognize and then apologize, ideally, right? And I think, as a diverse attorney, and we really want to give people the opportunity, and because sometimes we make mistakes too. So really, I guess, depending, I guess, on the situation, but really educating them, right? And explaining why that was offensive or harmful. And just telling them, and I try to do it myself, really just try not to focus on stereotypes and making assumptions. You really shouldn't try to make assumptions.
Yeah, I think we need to, always be thinking about how we're treating other people, and thinking about why, so that we can work to change our behaviors.
And Lauren says something very important too, is that after you apologize, commit to educating yourself so you can avoid making such an error in the future. And that is so important, because ultimately we want to implement change.
I think being receptive to feedback is important in our professional careers, and as we, become more diverse and have some blind spots, which I think we've all kind of acknowledged today exist. So slip ups are going to happen. I always try to view it as kind of approach it with empathy when someone tries to point out that something you did was wrong, instead of sometimes a natural inclination can be to get defensive. So I know we've got 5 minutes left. I'm happy to answer some questions from the audience, or just kind of open it up to you guys for final thoughts on the topic if you have them.
Maybe we could give our second
sort of-
code.
Sorry, were you talking, Andrea?
I was just suggesting maybe we give our second code now.
Oh, second code. Second code is changes. First code policy, second code changes, and I'll put that in the chat right now. I'm not like good at this stuff you're supposed to do. So we got a question from Tamar, unless Katie, go for final thoughts.
We can answer the question and then do a final thought.
I can give my, I've had situations at the firm where, where I've had inappropriate things said to me. And how I've dealt with first was I spoke to, my mentor and my sponsor, and I'm lucky enough and fortunate enough that I have multiple people that I can rely on here. And I have a very open and honest relationship and communication channel with them. So what I did first was address it and ask them, how they would handle it. And in a particular situation, they actually stepped in there for me and had that conversation with the person. So I didn't even, have to deal with it, essentially. But that's just an example that of an experience that I've been through before.
Yeah, I think it's important to have a sponsor in all senses, of someone to step in, because there's a lot of dynamics at play there in Tamar's question that aren't just
Exactly.
Male, female, or whatever the differences may be. Katie, I think I've cut you off like 3 times now.
Yeah. Just a sort of wrap up final thought. We've kind of said this in different ways, but I think it's just important to not think about these things as just being women's issues and just being issues that are important to people of diverse backgrounds. This should be important to everyone. We all, law firms are all improved by having diverse attorneys and women attorneys, and same for corporations. And that's why it's become so important to our clients that encourage more diverse attorneys. And it's important for all of us to be invested in it and not just think, well, that's a women's issue, or that's just for people of color. So it's something we should all be invested in.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I mean, I don't know the specifics standing here right now, but there was some study done of, like billions of dollars in lost revenue because of, failure to have diverse workforces and such. I don't know how they came up with that number, but, above all else, I think there are a few things standing in the way of more diverse culture and a more inclusive one too, because it also makes business sense. So we're right at time. I'd like to kind of thank everyone for joining us today. I thank the panel members for a fantastic discussion and much needed perspectives. I will be sending out kind of a follow-up email to all attendees with our contact information if you have any other questions. And I really appreciate everyone's time today, especially you 3.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Take
Bye.
care, everyone.